They told me every wedding is a promise, but mine felt like a warning I couldn't explain. I stood in front of the mirror in the bridal suite of St. Augustine's Chapel in downtown Chicago, my hands still for once, but my thoughts anything but calm. The dress was perfect, ivory silk flowing like it belonged in a dream I wasn't sure I had chosen for myself. Outside, the church bells rang softly, each sound blending into the distant hum of a city that never stopped moving, not even for moments like this. I should have felt happy. That was what everyone expected. My parents had flown in from Ohio, my relatives filled the pews downstairs, and Daniel Whitmore was waiting for me at the altar with the kind of smile that looked practiced, polished, safe. But safety and happiness were not the same thing, and I had started learning the difference too late to turn back now. A soft knock came at the door. My maid of honor, Claire, peeked in with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "It's time," she said gently, like she was speaking to someone fragile. I nodded, smoothing my veil even though it didn't need smoothing. Every step I took toward the aisle felt like stepping into a story someone else had already written for me. The chapel doors opened, and light spilled across the marble floor, warm and golden, painting the world in a kind of perfection that felt almost staged. Guests turned. Cameras lifted. Music began. I walked slowly, my arm linked with my father's, feeling the weight of every expectation pressing softly against my chest. Daniel stood at the front, straight-backed, confident, like a man stepping into a future he had already negotiated. He looked at me the way people look at something they believe they own. I tried to smile. I really did. But halfway down the aisle, something shifted. It was subtle at first, like a change in air pressure, like the room itself had become aware of something no one had announced. Conversations faded into whispers. A few guests turned toward the back of the chapel. The doors, heavy and carved in dark wood, opened without ceremony. No music, no announcement, just silence breaking into something heavier. And then I saw him. A man I didn't recognize stood at the entrance, unmoving, as if the entire room had simply adjusted around his presence. He didn't look like he belonged in a church full of white flowers and polite smiles. He looked like he belonged to a different world entirely, one where nothing was asked for, only decided. Tall, composed, wearing a dark suit that didn't need decoration to announce its value. His gaze swept across the room once, calm and deliberate, until it stopped. On me. I forgot how to breathe for a second. Not because he looked at me with familiarity, but because he didn't look surprised to see me at all. It was as if he had been expecting something. Or someone. The music faltered. Daniel noticed the shift and followed my gaze, confusion tightening his expression. The man at the door finally stepped forward, slow, measured, like every step had already been calculated long before he arrived. And in that moment, with a church full of witnesses and a future already halfway signed into existence, I had the strange, sinking feeling that my life had just been interrupted by someone who never needed permission to enter it. He stopped halfway down the aisle, not close enough to touch, but close enough that everything in the room seemed to lean toward him. His voice, when it finally came, was quiet, but it carried anyway. "That's not the bride I expected." And for reasons I didn't understand yet, those words didn't sound like a mistake. They sounded like a decision. For a moment after his words settled in the air, the entire chapel seemed to forget how to continue. I stood frozen halfway down the aisle, my hand still lightly holding my father's arm, unsure whether to move forward or step back, because nothing in me understood what forward even meant anymore. Daniel Whitmore finally broke the silence first, turning toward the man at the back of the chapel with a tense, confused expression that did not hide his irritation. "I think there has been some kind of mistake," Daniel said, trying to sound calm, trying to reclaim control of the moment. But the man in the dark suit did not look at him. His attention remained on me, steady and unreadable, like I was the only detail in the room worth confirming. He took another slow step forward, and the air shifted again, heavier now, as if the room itself was adjusting to his presence rather than resisting it. I felt every instinct I had ever ignored suddenly speaking at once, telling me to move, to speak, to understand something before it decided me. My father tightened his grip slightly, whispering my name under his breath like he was trying to bring me back to where I was supposed to be, but I could not feel that place anymore. The man stopped just a few feet away from the aisle, close enough that I could see the calm in his expression was not indifference, but certainty. The kind of certainty that did not ask permission because it never expected refusal. "Emily Carter," he said quietly, and hearing my name in his voice felt like something private had been spoken aloud in a room full of strangers. Daniel stepped forward again, more firmly this time. "Who are you, and why are you here?" he demanded. But the question landed without weight, like it was being answered before it finished forming. The man finally shifted his gaze toward Daniel, not with anger, not with challenge, but with the kind of stillness that made confrontation feel unnecessary. "I am here because something was arranged incorrectly," he said simply, as if correcting a detail on a document. Then his eyes returned to me. "You are not the bride I was told would be here." A ripple of confusion moved through the guests, soft murmurs rising and falling like waves that did not know where to land. My chest tightened. "I do not understand," I finally managed, my voice smaller than I intended. He studied me for a long moment, as if the answer was not in what I said but in what I was not saying. Then he took one more step closer, stopping just at the edge of my space without crossing it. "Then allow me to correct it," he said, and there was no force in his tone, only finality shaped like calm. Behind me, I heard Daniel's voice rise again, but it felt distant now, like it belonged to a different version of this day that was already fading. The man extended his hand slightly, not demanding, not pulling, simply offering a direction in a moment that no longer felt like it had many choices left. "You can remain where you are," he said softly, "or you can come with me and stop being part of something that was never meant for you." The words did not feel like an order. They felt like the beginning of an answer I had not yet learned how to refuse. For a long moment, no one moved. It was as if the chapel had been suspended between two versions of reality, one where I was still walking toward a familiar future, and another where everything I understood about that future had already been quietly rewritten. The man's words lingered in the air, not as a threat, not as a promise, but as something more unsettling, a certainty that did not require agreement to exist. I could feel Daniel behind me now, his presence tense and fractured, like he was trying to pull the moment back into order through sheer force of will. "This is insane," Daniel finally said, his voice sharp enough to cut through the silence. "You cannot just walk into my wedding and say things like that." The man did not react immediately. He simply turned his head slightly, as if acknowledging a noise that did not require correction. Then his attention returned to me, and somehow that silence felt louder than any argument being made around us. My father leaned closer to me, his voice low and urgent. "Emily, we do not know who this is," he said, confusion and fear mixing in a way I had never heard from him before. But I could not respond. My thoughts were no longer moving in straight lines. They were circling the same point again and again, trying to find logic in something that refused to behave logically. The man finally spoke again, his tone steady and controlled. "I was told a contract would be honored today," he said, not raising his voice, not addressing the crowd, but making it clear that the room itself was included in the statement. A ripple of unease moved through the guests, subtle but undeniable. I felt it too, not an understanding, but an instinct. Something about the word contract did not belong in this place, in this moment, in this version of my life. Daniel stepped forward again, his composure slipping further. "There is no contract involving her," he said firmly. "She is my fiancée." For the first time, something shifted in the man's expression, not surprise, not anger, but a faint narrowing of focus, like a detail had been introduced that required recalibration. He looked at Daniel, then back at me. "Then I was given incomplete information," he said quietly. The words should have felt like relief, like correction, like misunderstanding resolved. But instead they created something heavier, because incomplete information meant intention, and intention meant someone had planned for this moment without telling me I was part of it. My breath felt shallow now, my hands cold beneath the fabric of my dress. "I do not know what you are talking about," I said, finally finding my voice, though it sounded distant even to me. He studied me again, longer this time, as if deciding whether confusion was genuine or practiced. Then he spoke, softer than before, but with the same unbroken certainty. "That may be the first accurate thing said in this room," he replied. The statement did not comfort me. It unsettled me more than anything else. Behind me, Daniel's voice rose again, but I could no longer track the words clearly. The room felt too large and too small at the same time, as if every exit had moved slightly further away without anyone admitting it. The man took a final step closer, stopping just at the edge of the aisle, and for the first time I noticed something else in his expression beneath the calm. Not emotion, not softness, but recognition, like he had been looking for something specific and had just realized it might be standing directly in front of him. "Emily Carter," he said again, slower this time, as if confirming not identity, but alignment. My throat tightened. "Yes," I answered quietly. He nodded once, almost imperceptibly, and then said, "Then this situation is not what I was promised." And somehow, without touching me, without raising his voice, without asking anything at all, he made it clear that whatever came next would not continue without my awareness of it. The silence that followed his last words did not break. It simply shifted into something heavier, something that pressed against every corner of the chapel until even breathing felt like a deliberate act. I stood still at the center of it, aware that every eye in the room was now divided between two versions of my life, the one I had been walking toward and the one that had just stepped in without warning. Daniel moved closer to me, his presence tense, his voice lower now, but filled with disbelief. "Emily, you are not going to listen to this," he said, as if saying it firmly enough could undo everything that had already begun to change. I wanted to answer him, but my thoughts were no longer staying in place. They kept returning to the same point, the same impossible interruption that had turned my wedding into something unfamiliar. The man in the dark suit had not moved since his last statement. He stood with the same quiet control, as if waiting for a calculation to resolve itself. Then, without looking away from me, he spoke again. "There has been an error in identification," he said calmly, his voice carrying just enough to reach the front pews. A murmur passed through the guests, confused and uncertain, but no one dared interrupt him. My father tightened his grip on my arm again, this time more firmly. "Emily, we are leaving," he said under his breath, urgency breaking through his confusion. But my feet did not move. It was not defiance. It was something else, something deeper, like my body had not yet received instructions from my mind. The man finally shifted his attention toward Daniel again. "You are Daniel Whitmore," he said, not as a question, but as confirmation. Daniel straightened immediately, as if that recognition gave him ground to stand on. "Yes, and this is my wedding," he replied, forcing authority into his voice. The man studied him for a moment longer, then nodded slightly, as if placing him into a category that required no further attention. "Then you are the incorrect variable in this arrangement," he said simply. The words did not carry insult, only removal, like Daniel had been mathematically excluded from something larger than he realized. Daniel's expression tightened. "You cannot just walk in here and speak like this," he said again, more sharply. "Now, you do not belong here." That was the first time the man's expression changed, not into anger, but into something closer to clarity. "I belong wherever the agreement places me," he replied evenly. The phrase landed in the room with an uncomfortable weight, and I felt it again, that unfamiliar sense that something structured existed beneath all of this, something I had not been told about. I took a small step backward without realizing it. The man noticed immediately. His gaze followed the movement, not invasive, not forceful, but precise. "You do not need to be afraid," he said, though the words did not sound like reassurance so much as observation. I swallowed, forcing myself to speak. "I am not part of any agreement," I said, though the uncertainty in my voice betrayed me. For a brief moment, something like reconsideration passed through his expression. Then he spoke again, quieter this time. "That is exactly what I was told as well," he said. The implication of that sentence settled slowly into the space between us. If I was not part of it, and he had been told otherwise, then someone had placed my name into a structure I did not recognize. Behind me, Daniel's frustration broke through again. "This is absurd," he said. "There is no arrangement. There is no misunderstanding. She is my fiancée." But the man no longer looked at him. His attention had returned fully to me, and for the first time, I felt the full weight of being observed by someone who was not trying to convince me of anything. He simply spoke again, calm and final. "Then we will resolve the contradiction," he said. And in that moment, I understood that whatever this was, it had already moved beyond explanation. The word contradiction lingered in the air long after he said it, as if it had been placed there deliberately rather than spoken. I stood in the center aisle of the chapel, surrounded by silence that no longer felt empty but controlled, like the room itself was waiting for instructions I had not been given. Daniel's patience finally broke. He stepped forward again, his voice rising with frustration that no longer tried to hide itself. "This is my wedding," he repeated louder this time, as if volume could restore ownership of the moment. "You need to leave." The man in the dark suit finally turned his head toward him again, slowly, acknowledging him fully for the first time. "Your wedding," he repeated softly, as if testing the phrase rather than accepting it. Then he looked back at me. I felt it immediately, that shift in attention, not emotional, not personal in the way I understood emotions, but absolute, like focus narrowing through a lens. "Emily Carter," he said again, and hearing my name repeated in that tone made it feel heavier than it had ever been before. I swallowed, trying to steady my breathing. "I do not understand what you want from me," I said, my voice smaller than I intended. There was no immediate answer. Instead, he reached into his inner jacket pocket, not abruptly, not threateningly, but with a calm precision that made the movement feel deliberate in a way I could not yet interpret. A small folded document appeared in his hand. He did not open it fully. He simply held it where I could see the edge of it. "This was delivered to me under your name," he said. The statement did not feel like accusation. It felt like confirmation of something already recorded elsewhere. My heart tightened. "That is not possible," I said immediately. "I have never signed anything like that." He studied me for a moment longer, as if weighing my reaction against something only he could see. Then he lowered the document slightly. "Then someone signed it for you," he said calmly. A ripple of unease passed through the guests again, louder this time, no longer contained. I felt my father's grip loosen slightly, as confusion replaced fear in his expression. Daniel looked between the two of us, his frustration now mixed with something less controlled. "This is insane," he said again, but this time it sounded less certain. The man ignored him completely. His focus remained on me. "I do not operate on assumptions," he continued. "I operate on verified terms. And the terms I received included your identity." My mind struggled to keep up, every sentence adding weight without adding clarity. "I have no knowledge of any terms," I said again, forcing each word out carefully. For the first time, something changed in his expression, subtle but noticeable. Not doubt, but recalibration. As if my response did not match what had been predicted. He lowered the document fully now, holding it at his side. "Then there are only two possibilities," he said. "Either you are not the person referenced in this agreement, or you have not been informed of it." The way he said it made both options feel equally unsettling. Daniel stepped forward again, his voice sharper now. "There is no agreement," he insisted. "She is not part of anything involving you, or anyone like you." The man finally turned his attention toward him again, and this time it lingered longer. "If that is true," he said quietly, "then someone has placed her in a position that will require correction." The word correction landed differently than anything else had so far. Not violent, not emotional, but procedural, like something that had gone out of alignment. I felt a cold stillness settle in my chest that I could not explain. "Correction," I repeated quietly, more to myself than to him. His gaze returned to me immediately. "Yes," he said simply, "because right now, you are standing in the center of a system that does not recognize your current status." The chapel felt smaller after that sentence, as if the walls had moved closer without anyone noticing. Daniel reached for my hand again, but I hesitated, my attention still locked on the man in front of me. For the first time since he arrived, his expression softened slightly, not into warmth, but into something closer to certainty returning after disruption. "And until that is resolved," he said, "you are not where you are supposed to be." The silence that followed his last statement felt different from everything that had come before it. It was no longer confusion or shock, but something closer to anticipation, as if the room itself was waiting for a next step that had already been scheduled elsewhere. I stood still, my thoughts fragmented, trying to understand how I had become part of something described in such mechanical terms. Not a bride, not a fiancé, not even a mistake anymore, but a variable in a system I had never seen. Daniel's hand finally reached mine again, firmer this time. "Emily, we are leaving," he said, but his voice lacked the certainty it had carried earlier. It was not a command anymore. It was an attempt. I did not move. The man in the dark suit observed this silently, his expression unchanged, as if he was simply confirming a condition he had already expected. "That is a valid option," he said calmly after a moment, his voice steady enough that it cut through the rising tension without effort. "However, it does not resolve the underlying issue." Daniel's frustration returned immediately. "There is no issue," he said. "She is a person, not an item in whatever system you are talking about." For the first time, the man acknowledged him fully. He turned slightly, not aggressively, but with complete focus. "I agree," he said simply. "That is why this situation is unusual." The words hung there, stripping emotion out of the moment and replacing it with something colder and harder to interpret. I felt my breath tighten. "Unusual in what way?" I asked before I could stop myself. His attention shifted back to me immediately. "In every formal record I received, your participation was voluntary and confirmed," he said. "But your response indicates no awareness of such participation." The phrasing made my stomach tighten. Participation. As if I had been included in something without ever being informed. "I have never participated in anything involving you," I said firmly, though my voice trembled slightly despite my effort. He studied me again, longer this time, and I could see something subtle shift behind his calm expression. Not doubt, but assessment. Like recalculating probability. "Then someone has made an error in representation," he said. A soft wave of unease moved through the guests again, louder now, more visible. My father finally stepped forward slightly, his voice unsteady. "This is a wedding," he said, as if reminding everyone of the basic structure of reality. "This is not a negotiation." The man did not react immediately. Then he turned his head just slightly toward the front of the chapel, as if acknowledging the statement without accepting its relevance. "It appears that assumption was made incorrectly," he said. My heart beat harder now, not from fear alone, but from the growing realization that nothing in this exchange was emotional for him. It was procedural, precise, and detached from the expectations everyone else in the room still held. "Incorrectly," I repeated quietly. He looked at me again. "Yes," he said, "and when incorrect data is introduced into a controlled arrangement, resolution is required." Daniel tightened his grip on my hand. "You are not taking her anywhere," he said firmly now, stepping slightly in front of me. The man observed this without reaction for a moment. Then he spoke again, his voice still level. "That is not a decision I am currently making," he said. "That is a consequence of the arrangement already in motion." The word consequence settled heavily in the space between us. I felt my chest tighten, not because I understood more, but because I understood less with every explanation given. "I want clarity," I said finally, my voice more stable now, driven by frustration rather than fear. He looked at me immediately, as if he had been waiting for that exact request. "Clarity requires access to the origin of the arrangement," he said, "which I do not currently possess in complete form." That sentence created a silence deeper than the others. Even Daniel hesitated. "You do not know who involved me in this," I said slowly. He paused briefly, then answered, "Not yet." The word "yet" changed everything about the room again. It implied movement, investigation, continuation beyond this moment. I felt something shift inside me, a realization that this was no longer about interruption, but about retrieval of truth that had already been set in motion before I ever stepped into this chapel. And for the first time since the doors opened, I understood that leaving or staying was no longer the center of the situation. The center was something I had not been told, something already moving beneath all of this, waiting to be uncovered. For the first time since he entered the chapel, something in his expression changed in a way I could not immediately categorize. It was not emotion in the way people showed emotion, not anger or satisfaction or hesitation, but something closer to recognition of a missing element finally being named. He stood still, his attention fixed on me, and the entire room seemed to wait for his next interpretation of what was unfolding. Daniel was still beside me, but his presence now felt like it belonged to a different layer of this moment, one that was losing influence with every passing second. "You keep saying arrangement," I said carefully, my voice steadier now, shaped more by confusion than fear. "But I was never part of anything like that." The man did not answer immediately. Instead, he looked past me briefly, as if considering the structure of the room itself, then returned his gaze to me with the same controlled precision. That is the discrepancy, he said. And discrepancies require resolution before continuation. The word continuation made something in my chest tighten again. This was not a conversation anymore, not in the way I understood conversations. It was analysis being performed in real time with me as the reference point. Daniel stepped forward again, his patience finally collapsing. You are speaking like she is a transaction, he said sharply. She is not. The man turned toward him slowly, and for the first time, there was something closer to direct acknowledgement rather than dismissal. I am speaking based on documentation, he replied evenly, not interpretation. A murmur passed through the guests again, softer now, but more uncertain. My father's hand loosened slightly from my arm, as if even he no longer knew what he was holding on to. I felt a strange distance growing between me and the life I had been walking into minutes earlier. What documentation? I asked before I could stop myself. His attention returned to me immediately. A transfer record, he said. The words landed in the air without context, and for a moment I thought I had misunderstood. A what? I repeated. He did not change his tone. A formal transfer record listing you as the referenced party in a binding arrangement between two entities. My breath caught slightly. Daniel immediately reacted. That is impossible, he said. No one transfers a person like that. That is not how anything works. The man finally allowed a pause, as if measuring the statement before responding. It is how certain agreements are structured, he said calmly. I felt my fingers go cold. I have never agreed to anything like that, I said again, more firmly this time. He studied me for a longer moment, and for the first time I saw something subtle shift behind his controlled expression. Not belief or disbelief, but recalculation of error source. Then either your awareness is incomplete, he said, or your inclusion was executed without direct consent confirmation. The words made my stomach tighten. Without my consent, I repeated quietly. He did not correct me. Daniel stepped in closer again, his voice now controlled but tense. You are saying someone listed her in something without her knowledge, he said. The man nodded once. That is the current inconsistency. A long silence followed. The guests were no longer whispering now. They were listening fully, as if the structure of the ceremony had been replaced by something none of them had expected to witness. I looked at Daniel, then at my father, then back at the man standing at the front of the chapel. So what happens now? I asked. My voice sounded distant even to me, as if it belonged to someone standing slightly outside of my own body. The man did not answer immediately. Instead, he took a slow step forward, not into intrusion, but into clarity. Now, he said finally, we identify the origin of the entry. The phrase should have meant nothing to me, but it did. It meant there was a point where my life had been recorded into something larger without my knowledge. And if you cannot, Daniel asked tightly, then what? The man's gaze did not shift. Then the arrangement cannot proceed in its current form, he said. The room seemed to tighten around that statement. I felt my pulse in my throat now, not from fear alone, but from the realization that I was no longer standing in the middle of a wedding. I was standing in the center of something being investigated around me. And for the first time, I understood that the man was not here to take me or claim me or interrupt me. He was here because my existence in his world had already been recorded somewhere I had never seen. For several seconds after his last statement, no one in the chapel spoke. It was not silence created by confusion anymore, but silence created by recalculation, as if every person in the room was trying to rewrite what they thought this moment was. I stood still at the center of it, feeling as though the ground beneath my feet had shifted into something less certain than it had been minutes before. Daniel's hand was still near mine, but the pressure had changed, no longer pulling me forward, only holding on as if unsure what direction even existed now. You are saying she is listed in something official, Daniel said again, slower this time, as if repeating it carefully might expose its flaw. The man in the dark suit did not hesitate. Yes, he replied, in a verified record that governs association and responsibility. The phrasing made the air feel heavier again. Not emotional, not dramatic, but structural, like I had been placed inside a framework I had never seen the blueprint for. I swallowed, trying to steady my breathing. What kind of record? I asked quietly. His gaze returned to me immediately, and I felt that same precise attention again, as if I was no longer a person in a wedding but a point of reference in an investigation. A binding allocation record, he said. The words meant nothing and everything at the same time. Daniel exhaled sharply. That is not real, he said. You cannot just assign someone to something like property. The man finally turned toward him fully, and this time there was a faint pause before he spoke. It is not ownership, he said. It is responsibility designation. The distinction did not comfort anyone. It only made the structure feel more distant and more difficult to challenge. My father finally spoke, his voice uncertain. Emily has never been involved in anything like this, he said, almost pleading now. The man acknowledged him briefly. That aligns with her statement, he replied. Then his attention returned to me again, which is why this situation requires verification. I felt my thoughts slow, each sentence sinking deeper before the next one arrived. Verification of what exactly? I asked. He answered without delay. The origin of your inclusion. A ripple moved through the room again, softer this time, but more unsettled. I could feel eyes shifting between us, trying to interpret meaning that kept changing shape. Daniel stepped closer again, his voice lower but still tense. And if you cannot find it, he said, what happens to her? The question hung in the air longer than anything else had. The man did not answer immediately. When he finally spoke, his tone remained unchanged. Then the record is invalid, he said, and any actions associated with it cannot proceed. That should have sounded like relief. Instead, it sounded like suspension, like everything about my life had been placed on hold by something I never agreed to enter. I felt a strange emptiness form in my chest. Not fear exactly, but disorientation. So, I am not being taken, I said slowly, trying to understand what remained. The man looked at me for a moment longer, and for the first time his expression shifted slightly again, not into warmth, but into something closer to acknowledgement of my question itself. You are not currently assigned, he said. The word currently made my stomach tighten. Daniel immediately responded. Then this is over, he said quickly, as if trying to close the moment before it expanded further. But the man did not move. It is not over, he said calmly. It is unresolved. The difference between those two words changed the entire atmosphere again. Unresolved meant still active, still open, still continuing somewhere beyond what we could see. I looked around the chapel again, at the guests who no longer looked like witnesses to a wedding, but observers of something far less familiar. Then I looked back at him. What happens next? I asked, my voice quieter now, but more steady. He studied me for a moment, as if choosing his answer carefully. Next, he said, we locate the source of the record that placed you here. And in that moment, I understood that whatever had interrupted my wedding had never been about the ceremony at all. It had been about something written long before I ever walked down the aisle. For a long moment after his last words, nothing in the chapel moved. It felt as if even time itself had lost direction, suspended between what had already been spoken and what had not yet been decided. I stood in the center of it all, aware that every breath I took now belonged to a version of this day I had never prepared for. Daniel's hand finally released mine completely, not in anger, but in a slow realization that holding on was no longer changing anything. My father looked at me as if waiting for me to speak, but I had no words that felt accurate anymore. The man in the dark suit remained exactly where he had been, still, composed, his attention steady on me as if I were not a disruption to a wedding, but the center point of something far larger. We will proceed with verification, he said calmly, his voice carrying across the chapel without effort. Until the origin of the record is confirmed, no designation can be enforced or dismissed. The phrase echoed in my mind, not as instruction, but as acknowledgement that my life had been placed into a category I did not authorize and now required correction. Daniel finally broke the silence, his voice strained. So you are just going to leave her like this? He asked. The man turned his head slightly toward him, not dismissive, not engaged, but factual. She is not being left, he said. She is in a pending state of resolution. The words should have sounded distant, but instead they felt clinical, like something written in a system that did not care about emotion, only accuracy. I felt my chest tighten again. What does that even mean for me? I asked quietly. His gaze returned to me immediately. It means your current status cannot be confirmed or acted upon until the source is identified, he said. I swallowed, trying to steady my breathing. And how long does that take? I asked. He paused for the first time, just briefly, before answering. That depends on how quickly the origin can be traced. The uncertainty in that answer was the first thing that felt human in the entire exchange. Around us, the guests remained silent, watching, as if they were witnessing something that had moved beyond ceremony and into something unfamiliar enough that no one wanted to define it incorrectly. My father stepped closer again, his voice softer now. "Emily, come with me," he said gently, as if trying to pull me back into something simpler, something understandable. But I could not move. Not because I was stopped, but because I no longer knew what direction was forward. The man in the suit observed this without interruption, then spoke again. "There is no requirement for immediate relocation," he said. "You are not under enforcement." The distinction settled heavily in the space between us. Not taken, not assigned, not released, just unresolved. Daniel exhaled sharply, frustration returning. "So this is just going to continue," he said. The man answered without hesitation. "It will continue until clarity is achieved." I looked at him more carefully then, trying to understand what kind of world defines people this way, not through relationships or choices, but through records and verification. "And if the record is wrong?" I asked slowly. "Then what happens to everything built on it?" He studied me for a long moment before answering. "Then it is dismantled," he said simply. The word dismantled should have sounded dramatic, but in his voice it sounded procedural, like correcting an error in documentation. I felt something shift inside me at that, not fear exactly, but awareness that my entire life had just been placed beside something I had never seen, waiting for confirmation of whether it belonged there or not. The man finally took a step back, his presence still steady, but no longer advancing. "Until verification is complete," he said, "you remain outside of assignment." And for the first time since he entered the chapel, I understood that whatever had interrupted my wedding was not a confrontation, not an abduction, not even a mistake, but the beginning of someone trying to find out why I had ever been placed into his world at all.